Okay, so we're joined today with Sam Whiting to talk about digital culture and the commodification of taste. Thanks for joining us, Sam. Um, you
Thanks for
can
having me, Steve.
you can learn more about Sam here in terms of the research he's done so far and the research he's doing. But maybe we can start off, Sam, by telling us a little bit about what you're up to at the moment in your research.
Yeah, sure. I've got a few different projects. One on Wollongong as a regional music city, another on alternative ownership and operating models for grassroots music venues, looking at like non-profit community ownership models, and then also looking more and more at the impact of AI and streaming on Australian music specifically.
Yeah, yeah, and I suppose that last one is kind of why I've asked you to come and chat about the topic here today.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's get into it. So. Um, One of the readings this week is Eric Drott's book, Streaming Music, Streaming Capital, that I know you're kind of familiar with. And it
Mhm.
talks a lot about kind of how the kind of platformization of culture has fundamentally changed consumers' relationship with um, how they access culture and how they listen, how they watch, and all these kind of things. And it particularly wants to emphasize a way that it's really moved towards how these things are kind of technologies of wealth redistribution. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the way that we don't own anything anymore, we don't own our culture in the way that we might have used to have at least bought a copy of an artifact. So I guess the comparison might be that before you buy a record, which was literally a copy of the original artifact, but you owned that copy and you could play it whenever you wanted. And now we have to, pay to access this huge, what is a very huge library of
Mm.
music. But it sort of means that we're somewhat alienated from our own consumption practices and our own tastes. And because there's so many intermediaries between us and the artists, in terms of the streaming platforms, the labels that sell the rights to the streaming platforms, the advertisers who form a very big third-party market for the streaming platforms. All of those intermediaries are trying to extract some sort of value from that interaction, and that kind of warps the experience in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's like the experience of consuming music, for instance, seems to have moved from this kind of commonality of kind of mass people getting together and doing stuff to kind of a more individualized way of consuming, right?
Yeah, and I think the atomization is the thing that I probably hate the most about it. Like I find it so I quit Spotify 2 years ago, and it was mainly because of this. Like, I felt very alone in my listening experiences because the algorithm had got me pegged so neatly that I wasn't actually really listening to that much music that my peer group was even listening to because I'm a metalhead and Spotify was like, here's another like juicy beatdown hardcore band that's just like 2 minute like
Yeah.
bang 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 songs and like it was just sort of like spoon feeding me great like still great music but stuff that was like comfortable or like really in my frame of reference to the point where I wasn't being challenged like I wasn't discovering new artists or new subgenres or new kind of sound stuff that I'd be like, oh, that's a bit different. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah.
And so I felt very atomized, and then that experience got me to reflect more and more. Okay, it was like, well, how have these platforms got me pegged so neatly? How has that got me in a box? And what does that mean for music consumption generally? Is everyone else experiencing
Mm.
this in the same way? And I feel like it's by design because once you're in a neat little box, it's they can sell you all the other types of products. They're much more. It's much easier for these platforms and the third-party advertising companies that they associate with to sell you as a sort of as a profile
Yeah.
or a particular type of consumer. And so, yeah, and it also, again, it alienated me from my own taste. It alienated me from the things that, really enjoy and
Mm.
love. And it also alienated me from my friends because I was a specific silo of listening.
Yeah.
And
And you
that,
weren't
and
you
that,
weren't listening to the same stuff to be able to have conversations about it or
Yeah, and that atomization, not to exaggerate, but that can make you like when you extrapolate that and you think about all the different ways you consume culture, not only music, but TV and film and YouTube and news, you can end up feeling very isolated and a bit lonely, and and then you become sort of almost, you can see how there's a rabbit hole there where you become radicalized,
Yeah,
even if it's like in a benign way, you're sort of just like in this very niche um, pocket of your own consumption. And I
yeah,
think that sort of stratification and atomization, I mean, not to sound conspiratorial, but like that political project does benefit rich and powerful, corporations, because then we're not thinking about you're not thinking about how much you have in common with your friends or your colleagues, your workmates. You're thinking more about like how much you draw lines and distinctions between them.
yeah, yeah. And so one of the interesting things that this makes is that argument this makes is it kind of, yeah, you're kind of talking about this already, I suppose, is the way that this kind of changes the way that music interpolates us. And interpolates us this idea that kind of social structures kind of and culture hails us into kind of being particular things. And kind of, I suppose, what you've already kind of discussed there in terms of the way that these streaming services much more individualize us as kind of listeners rather than kind of the more community, subcultural kind of scene way of doing it in the
Yeah.
past. And
Yeah.
the
Well, yeah.
book
Sorry,
does a
on.
really good job of like thinking about, how the move from music as a kind of art form to a data point changes the meaning of music as well. So what do you think about that?
Well, there's two things there. Like the way that, previously you would discover new music is if a friend usually showed it to you. So there was a social process there through which you're engaging with new music. And then sort of your tastes and your identity were articulated through a social interaction that was actually informed by an actual exchange with a living, breathing person who probably lived near you and had similar experiences to you and came from a similar background to you.
Mm,
And now we get our recommendations from an algorithm that sort of looks at all our entire consumption profile, so that's one thing. But then music as a data point, I think has and the streaming has really obviously set the terms for this kind of consumption and production and distribution practices of music as data rather than music as social experience um,
mm.
or something that informs your cultural identity more broadly or reflects where you live and where you come from. Um, I think this music as data has really laid the grounds for AI and this sort of really passive, laid back mode of listening. Because um, when music becomes data, then it becomes much easier for algorithmically curated recommendation systems to serve you music as data that is palatable. You're not going to like the goal is to make sure that you don't hit skip or you don't turn it off. I mean, the
Yeah,
only competitor to Spotify is silence. And so that means that you end up sort of a much more passive mode of listening.
yeah,
You're not critical. You're not like engaging with it in a like frontal lobe capacity. It was like, oh, does this music speak to me? How do I feel about these lyrics? It's sort of like this is something I'm listening to while I'm doing something else. And
yeah.
like,
So it moves away from experiencing and consuming music as an art form or as a kind of background mood kind of
yeah,
thing going on. Yeah,
and like almost, and I think Drott in another article talks about how it's almost now it's just a performance enhancing element
yeah,
of capitalist
yeah. Here's a
productivity.
playlist to help you sleep so you can be better at work tomorrow.
Yeah, or yeah, here's a playlist to help you focus on this spreadsheet.
Yeah,
And I think that so that laid back listening, there's multiple effects of that. But one of the main things I've been thinking about is that how it's made us much more open to AI generated music and
mm,
how we're much less sort of critical. I think like if AI generated music had dropped, like Gen AI generated music had dropped 20, 30 years ago into the music market in the way it exists now, into that cultural context, there would be much more like express horror,
yeah,
industrial backlash,
Yeah.
rather than a sort of passive acceptance of like, oh, this is just the inevitable march of technological
Yeah.
accelerationism. So yeah, so it's sort of like music as data lays the foundations for all of these new types of, you know, value extraction,
Yeah.
cultural, cultural experiences, this different social relationship to music, that I personally am kind of horrified by, but obviously it's very profitable.
Yeah. 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 Um, so yeah, and it also like as I've discussed throughout the course of turning music into data means that like it's that information's been enrolled into all kinds of other things like, algorithms decide who gets insurance, who gets access to rentals and all these things that you don't necessarily sign up to um, Spotify for. Points out that like, music in a sense is now used as a tracking device, means by which information about listeners' everyday lives may be collected, aggregated, and put to work. And so, like, I think what the quantification of music here, like I think the likes of us, white guys that like rock music, tend to have these kind of qualitative judgments about all kinds of stuff, and like have see relations of taste as being particularly important. What does the quantification of those things mean, do you think, to that kind of point of view of music in terms of how music is judged and
Yeah. Well,
critiqued and consumed?
this is probably the question that's closest to my actual research and stuff I've been working on. It's so the quantification of music means that we tend to assume, or platforms tend to assume, algorithmically curated recommendations tend to assume that what's popular is good. That's like Taylor Swift has the numbers, therefore Taylor Swift is good. Therefore, the algorithm should recommend Taylor Swift more.
Yeah,
And so basically you have this ever consolidating top band of artists that are like, this is music that everyone enjoys, or the biggest majority of people enjoy. So therefore, we should just keep pushing that. And it's the major record labels definitely incentivize that. Like, let's remember that major record labels are massive shareholders in Spotify. Spotify could not exist without major record labels. The major labels hold all the licenses to the massive catalog that gives Spotify value.
mhm,
So they're invested in that. What that means is that Australian artists, emerging and especially emerging Australian artists, are starting from a really low base
yeah,
because not only are they competing with Taylor Swift, Olivia Dean, any other Anglophone artists, English speaking artists, who's doing really well, but the algorithms and the platforms are on the side of those big artists. They're not on the side
yeah.
of emerging Australian artists.
In fact, the
Even
companies the companies pay Spotify to push artists they're trying to promote, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, there is
Old school payola kind of stuff.
there's definitely sort of like pay to play
Yeah, yeah,
happening. I mean, Spotify argues that it only enforces that stuff from for emerging artists if they rescind their royalty rights. But
yeah. But it doesn't
but
just
that
do it for
also
doesn't just do it for pop music, right? It also does it for all the genres. So if you're interested in
yeah,
particular,
yeah, yeah, of
you're
course.
interested in like punk rock or something, you're more likely to get, I don't know, Good Charlotte and Green Day rather than kind of up and coming
Yeah.
underground bands. Yeah,
Yeah, so it actually, yeah, it sort of aggregates demand towards established or popular artists
yeah,
across the musical spectrum.
yeah,
And so what that does, literally, and there is data that proves this, is that it homogenizes that form of music.
yeah,
So what you'll find is, it might be a metalcore band, but they'll be more likely to include the kinds of production effects, catchy choruses,
mm,
the types of, the breakdown goes here
yeah,
rather than here.
yeah,
That serves the algorithm,
yeah,
or fits most neatly with that kind of established band. And that's really bad for that. And there's lots of research now to demonstrate. The Australia Institute's just published a report, but there's also Tim Kelly's a PhD student. A lot of research that establishes is that all of this is really bad for Australian music in
yeah,
particular, because we're an Anglophone music market that does create a lot of contemporary popular music, but we don't have any of the structural protections, and we're competing
mm,
with all of these
mm.
other artists. And I mean,
Yeah,
of course, I'm not saying that like I'm not making a qualitative judgment about Taylor Swift. I quite like some Taylor Swift songs, but there's just so much more industrial
yeah,
and cognitive and technical power pushing those artists when as opposed to a local emerging artist in
yeah.
Australia.
And so if surveillance capitalists are so interested in music in terms of they see it as kind of a reflection of us, what is it about music that's so important to kind of our lives?
Oh, well, it's sort of like, I don't know, it's kind of carnal or it's very cathartic for me in a way. So it
Yeah,
speaks to like a part of your
yeah,
soul that kind of like goes beyond expression
yeah,
in a lot of ways. Like,
yeah,
being a metalhead, I also know that most metalheads are pretty lovely, well-adjusted,
yeah,
extroverted, friendly people. And there's some kind of music psychology stuff that sort of proves that metalheads get a lot of their negative emotions out by listening to like a cathartic, heavy music,
mm,
and therefore they feel a little bit more refreshed than other people.
yeah, yeah,
And that like that's really hard to explain. Like that sort of defies common sense or traditional logic of like if
yeah,
you listen to negative music, you should be a negative person. So therefore, because it gets into our so much of our like history, our like music can speak to some really deep trauma sometimes. I've
mm,
been to shows where grown men are crying.
yeah,
It's just, it really has a very kind of
yeah,
visceral effect. And therefore, like if you can quantify what that is and cross-reference it to a data point over here about something else, then it's very, very valuable.
yeah,
It's a very valuable insight into
yeah,
someone's history,
yeah,
what they value, the people they associate with,
yeah.
um,
So
and that, yeah,
there's been lots of sociology on this, hasn't there? So we won't go into this too much, but like there's some
yeah,
current interesting stuff here. Like Webster finds that people that are into music in particular find the algorithmic recommendations kind of an affront to their own kind of taste values, and they want to discover stuff themselves and find being music pushed on them as a bit of a kind of form of symbolic violence. Seaver talks about this kind of computing taste kind of stuff, particularly the way that kind of music is now disseminated um, through different kind of forms of technology, particularly now streaming dominates. And, again, algorithmic recommender systems need to fundamentally change the way sociologists think of taste because it's
mm,
just not simply organic anymore. It's not coming from community and friends. It's being driven
mm,
by this data. Your own recent work, though, has been thinking about like the rise of AI. So can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, Spotify itself is making AI music and putting it on its platform, and in some ways they're doing that so they don't have to pay royalties to the music companies. We have this band here that was kind of in the news last year, Velvet Sundown, that was getting 350,000 plays a month, but there's no real evidence that it actually exists. All the
mm,
photos, all the music seems to be completely AI generated. What's
mm.
going on?
Well, Spotify is technically incentivized to have AI generated music on the platform because it's royalty free. So it doesn't have to pay out royalties to living artists for playing that music. So there is a structural incentive, and without regulation and legislation, that will remain. Um, I don't like to do the whole doomsday. I don't not particularly invest in the whole kind of doomsday rhetoric that, this is the end of living artists and music as we know it. We've been kind of hearing that about hologram artists for a long
Yeah,
time, things like that. So I think people do have a very visceral human connection to living artists. And it goes, beyond their image and the art they create. It's more, and it's about the sort of how that connects to their life story and then therefore the listener's life story. I do think it's an interesting way of thinking about copyright, though. It actually opens this really interesting box of
mm,
like, is copyright fit for purpose? Is actually this the way we should ascribe value to this? Maybe labor, maybe thinking about music as labor is a more effective way to
yeah,
kind of think about the value that is ascribed in a musical object.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
In the way that going to work for whoever you're selling your labor, you're not selling your rights to a specific
Mm.
intellectual property. So yeah, that's a lot more. There's a lot of interesting question marks. Is like, well, how do we measure the value of music if copyright's no longer fit for purpose?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah. Okay, so moving towards the end here, like I just kind of wanted to point out here that you know, much of the kind of critical work here points towards the extraction of music is benefiting, particularly already rich people. Economic power is being consolidated by these things. Um, and there's a kind of, as we've discussed in other parts of the course, it fundamentally changes in a way what culture is. We've gone into that in a few different angles. I'm particularly interested in from this kind of rentier way, that multinational companies now increasingly finding ways to kind of make us subscribe to things, make us kind of get a cut of our day-to-day lives and financialize more and more aspects of it. So from your point of view, though, can you sum up what's important here and to give us a bit of a clue where you think things might go?
Well, democracy is important. Like we can only the only entities that can really kind of stand up to these corporations and these specific forces of cultural change are workers themselves. So, unions, which are democratic institutions that everyday people can get involved in, have actually won some really important concessions. So, the Writers Guild of America and the Screen Actors Guild are going into bargaining now with major Hollywood studios, and one of the sticking points for those unions will be negotiating fairer terms in relation to the use of AI, but also governments as well regulating these platforms. Australia, I know it basically just maintained the status quo, but the status quo was upholding, a conventional definition of copyright as it applies to the extraction of pre-existing material and the replication of it in a recent decision, and that went in the face of the Productivity Commission and the tech lobby, and that is actually much braver than the US or the UK have been able to be in the face of these changes. So there are, yeah, democratic grassroots, there are democratic organizations and institutions that are fighting back against this, and it's all
Yeah.
about everyday people kind of getting involved in that decision making to prove that this is something that's important to them, and they'd like better regulation of in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Sam, that was great. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Steve.